Beleza. Vou começar aqui. Ok, podemos começar.
Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the third session of the third symposium of the Rubem Alves International Society. We have had a couple of days that have been rich in the kinds of conversations and topics that have been discussed. And today we are looking forward to hearing two wonderful scholars who will share with us some of the work that they are doing, which interact with Rubem Alves on many instances. But before we introduce them, let me just welcome all participants and acknowledge some of those who have been supporting us and making this event possible. The title of this symposium, the theme is God is Dead, Long Live God, Suffering and Hope in Times of Pandemic. O CIRA, or the Rubem Alves International Society, and its coordinating board is working together with a number of organizations and schools which are supporting this event in many ways. This is an international event, multilingual event, organized without money, based on the work and service of many volunteers. So people from different parts of the world that are helping us. The first panel was organized in Brazil, the second one in Mexico. Today, we have this United States-based panel, and we'll have a panel also organized in Italy. And in order for that to be possible, we are counting with a number of people who have been working tirelessly during the several past days and including today. We acknowledge the Department of Religious Studies of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora, the EST School of Theology in São Leopoldo, the Institute of Ecumenical Studies, San Bernardini of Venice, the Theological Community of Mexico, and CETELA, Comunidade de Educação Teológica Ecumênica Latino-Americana e Caribenha. We're very thankful for all participants and representatives of those organizations. In order for you to be listening to this event in your own language, we have also volunteers who have been translating the event for us. Before I introduce them, let me just say a few words in Portuguese, in case there are people on YouTube who need to connect through Zoom in order to get the translation. Esse evento hoje, boa tarde a todos e todas. Esse evento de hoje é um evento que está sendo realizado em inglês, é a mesa nos Estados Unidos do simpósio da CIRA, e essa mesa, apesar de estar sendo em inglês, está sendo traduzida simultaneamente em português, mas para isso, cada participante tem que estar inscrito no evento e usando o Zoom. Eu acredito que a essa hora já há um link no chat do YouTube, e se você não está inscrito e gostaria de ouvir a tradução, e ter acesso à tradução simultânea, enquanto eu estou terminando essa abertura, você pode se inscrever rapidamente, acessar o canal do Zoom e participar. Uma outra coisa também muito importante é que esse é um evento interativo, a gente espera contar com as reações e as questões vindas de todos vocês, e a maneira como fazer isso é simplesmente usar o chat, seja do Zoom ou do YouTube, e essas questões vão ser transmitidas aos nossos palestrantes, e elas vão poder lê-las em português ou inglês e reagir a elas. Então, muito obrigado. Todo o evento, a partir de agora, vai ser em inglês. So, I was mentioning in Portuguese, and I would like to repeat that in English, that this is a very interactive event. We hope that everybody who is listening is not only listening to the wonderful sharing that we will see here, we will engage with, but we hopefully will also get your reactions, your questions, and those questions will, can be put on the chat via Zoom or YouTube. And you can, in those questions will be shared with us so that we can interact with you wherever you are. We have used this moment of introduction not only to thank those who have been supporting us, but also to acknowledge our honorary president who passed away last week. I will read an official note from Cira to Zwinglio Mota Dias, and to his family. Before I do that, let me thank Guilherme Brasil de Souza, my doctoral student, who connected me, and Cira and Professor Edson, our president, with Professor Milton Torres from UNASP. He is the professor in the programs of literature, translation, and interpretation. And through Professor Milton Torres, we have had this wonderful privilege of counting several students who have volunteered to translate on spot everything that's happening here. They did that on Monday from Portuguese to English. They are doing that today from English to Portuguese. I will just acknowledge their first name here. We have today Monica, Brielle, Bruno, and José. Our most sincere thanks, big thanks for all the work that we're doing, making it possible for more people to participate in this event. So Professor Zwinglio Mota Dias was the honorary president of CIRA after several years facing a serious illness. He passed away last week, so we are all saddened by his absence today, and we would like to use this opportunity also to honor him. So the Rubem Alves, so Zwinglio Mota Dias, he was born in 1941 and passed away in 2021. The Rubem Alves International Society loses its honorary president after a long and courageous battle with an illness. The first articulations for the creation of CIRA came from Zwinglio Dias, who was a student and a friend of Rubem Alves. Without Zwinglio's action, therefore, without his aggregating charisma, without his encouragement and connections, CIRA would not exist. We know, however, that Zwinglio had the same kind of impact on all environments he interacted with, all relationships, all instances. He was one of those thought-provoking and challenging people, but at the same time, someone who managed to be also pleasing and welcoming. He truly enjoyed life and conveyed that to whoever he interacted with. Evangelical in the most original and primal sense of the word, a Protestant to the core, who carried his faith and action to ultimate consequences. He masterfully managed to walk on the fine line that moves between denunciation and announcement, protest and hope. Always attentive to his time and its movements, he was a scathing critic of everything that dehumanized others and an animated promoter of the process that elevate everyone, and that promote the dignity of all people, of all life. It's impossible to measure the impact that Zwingli Mota Dias has had and will continue to have on the world. His many students, colleagues, brothers and sisters will deeply miss him. Anyone who had the pleasure of listening to him informally certainly heard one of the many delightful stories he told without repeating himself about places, people, repressions, struggles for justice, and ecumenical adventures. He traveled all over the world. He made friends around the planet. He sold ideas of a radical humanist Christianity wherever he went. Communities, churches, universities, social movements. Without Zwingli, without Zu, the world is a little sadder today. The entire Syria community extends its wishes of comfort and hope to his family and loved ones, and is committed to striving to live up to the legacy of its honorary president. It was indeed an honor, sir. Farewell. Let's take 1 minute of silence and honor Zwingli wherever we are. As I said in the beginning, we have two wonderful scholars speaking on this in this third panel of the third symposium of Syria. We will hear first Yohanna Agra Juncker. She is an assistant professor of art, religion, and culture and Louisville Institute postdoctoral scholar at Claremont School of Theology. In her artistic and educational practice, she explores the human capacity to imagine and retrieve generative ways of being, even in the face of impossibility. An ongoing learner of ancient healing and artistic modalities, her research proves the intersections of decoloniality, art history, and eco-criticism, as well as Amerindian ways of knowing, healing, and art making. We welcome Yohanna. It's not the first time you're speaking in one of our events. We are very pleased to have you with us. Welcome, Yohanna.
Thank you so much, Professor Raimundo Barreto. It is an immense pleasure to be here with all of you today. The title of my talk is Rubem Alves and the Art of Weaving Webs Over Our Voids. And before I share with you what I prepared today, I would like to start this talk as I start all my speaking engagements, naming the occupied lands upon which I stand. So today I'm joining you from my parents' house in Poplar Grove, Illinois, which is located in the unceded territory and home of several indigenous peoples, the Ho-Chunk, the Maiamia, the Potawatomi, the Sauk, the Meskwaki, Peoria, and Kickapoo. Their relationship with this land continues to this day, and this land was and is of great importance to indigenous peoples. And though we recognize this, those of us who work, who study, who live, and partake in conferences in unceded territories continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. So my kind invitation to you today is that you and I consider committing to both spiritually and materially rematriating the lands we occupy. As we gather on this day, a month before 2021 closes its curtains before us, I am compelled to think about the profound shifts that we have experienced in these last 2 years. We have all needed to mitigate the effects of a global pandemic, our nation's most pernicious sufferings, the violences that ensue from the worst muck of racialized, ableist, heterocapital, and settler colonialism, as Alexis Pauline Gumbs puts it. And nothing about our experience so far have been stable, predictable, or even encouraging. Nothing about this has been hopeful. We have been trying to adapt to a fast changing reality that has been overwhelming, disrupting, and marked by so much loss, like we just named a minute ago, so much death, so much violence, so much grief. Our families, our communities, our spaces, our lands, our territories are filled with bodies that are carrying an overlay of stories, experiences, memories that feel like webs that are spun out of pain, unrootedness, displacement, and trauma. From personal losses to grief, to struggles to remain alive, to catastrophic environmental collapses, the brutality of white supremacy and anti-Black racism in this country, the uprisings last year, the events of last week, the effects of settler colonialism, the extractivism, and the effects of that on our bodies, the rise of anti-immigration populism, fascist leaders all over the world, genocidal governments, and climate catastrophe. There is so much circulating our bodies right now. And with that note, I also have to say that I'm struggling with a bit of a health condition today. If I have to pause my talk, it's because I'm tending to my body for a couple of minutes. And when I look at all this, I am reminded of Adrienne Marie Brown when she writes that crises are everywhere, massive, 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 and we are small. Her words reverberate with me so profoundly. I do believe that there are crises happening everywhere, and I do feel so small sometimes. And when the sense of powerlessness, helplessness unfolds before me is when I typically find myself unconsciously turning to the work, the words, and the worlds of Rubem Alves. You can imagine I have been reading a lot of Rubem Alves these last 2 years and these last 20 months. Books like O Retorno Eterno, Por uma Educação Romântica, Creio na Ressurreição do Corpo, Me Perguntaram se Acredito em Deus, have all accompanied me as much as the literature he wrote for children. You see, I started reading Rubem Alves very early on. Well, I wasn't reading at 5, but I was flipping through some of his children's books because the first one I was ever gifted, some of you have heard me tell the story before, was Como Nasceu a Alegria. And though at that age, I could not really name why his stories moved me so deeply, I knew that the way he did not infantilize or filter out suffering, even from children's books, taught me something about our human capacity to live through the most agonizing of pains, the most unanswerable questions, and the most ecstatic or simple of joys. His children's books bear the mark of several linguistic axes, which are entire worlds in and of themselves. Image and text are kind of interwoven with this theopoetics and storytelling in a theology and a pedagogy of the senses and of the heart, to quote his colleague, Paulo Freire, who's right behind me here. Por uma Educação Romântica, Alves speaks about how the woundedness and the tragedies in life made him understand viscerally that literature, poetry, music, storytelling, a poignant piece of visual art were the nutrients for our hungry bodies, joy for our anguished souls. He writes, science is fire and pans, indispensable kitchenware. But poetics is like frango e okra, chicken and okra, frango e quiabo, delectable food for those who love that dish. His work is a tender reminder to never fall out of love with life. And as an educator, storyteller, world maker who embodied the verb esperançar, to hope, right, in an active form. He was a compulsive fruidor de vida. He conjured new life into being, even in the face of impossibility, interruption, obliteration, annihilation. So Alves's bodyography, to borrow from Cláudio Carvalhais, who's also been part of this gathering in years past, has taught me that we all share this capacity to interrupt death, to resurge, to invent new ways of being and creating in the world, because we are all made in the image and likeness of the primordial maker, the spider. As artists, you see spiders not only create beautiful works of art, structures that are at once fragile and resilient, beautiful and complex, a trap for praise, but also a table to feast. They're also weaver of worlds. As conjurer artists, spiders measure risks. They carry the gossamer within their bodies and set in motion a kind of co-creation with the divine that weaves webs over our voids. The thread that is hidden within her body allows her to plunge into the void so that the weaving can begin. The web, in a sense, is already within. Even before she leaps, it's already within. So part of my invitation today is to weave our own web over the voids that we have before us. Webs of exhaustion, disorientation, grief, isolation, a body that's aching and that's sick like mine, profound anxiety, groundlessness, a rib cage that sometimes seems to be caving in, lack of touch, unknowingness, fear of what kind of world we will walk into in a few weeks and months. And one of the ways I gather courage to stare at this void and begin my own weaving over it is by engaging with these emergent and urgent questions through the arts. Part of what I have been asking myself is how to awaken my senses, my playfulness, how to cultivate life, how to rest, how to cultivate pleasure and joy so fantastic, capable of remembering who we are, the songs that we sing, the worlds that stir our souls, the touch that heals. How can we lick our wounds? How can we begin to undo the trauma that we have all metabolized? And how can we commit to rest, to resistance, to the creation of loving rebellions, as Leanne Betasamosaki Simpson invites us? How can we reinvent our rituals, our spiritual practices, our ways of being with and around one another? How to resist the greed that seeps through the cement and the concrete and the fossil fuels and the hyperconnectivity and the hyperproductivity? How can we resist our numbing strategies, our places of forgetfulness, our collusion with systems of exclusion and exploitation? How can we build spaces to experiment with other ways of being, to invent other vocabularies and grammars, where we create other collective and corporeal practices for grounding, for connection, for affection, for tenderness, and for belonging? How can we reconnect ourselves with each other, the planet, the sacred? I believe Rubem Alves would invite us to pay attention to the spaces of poetic inventions, that weaving of webs, so that we can weave at webs over the voids and smuggle some kind of life and healing back into these landscapes of death in which we seem to be walking through. In similar ways, Luiz Antônio Simas thinks about the wisdom contained in our bodies, our spiritualities, our creative practices, as being able to open up pathways for us to resist all that renders our bodies domesticated, lifeless, and submerged in what he names the carrego colonial. And think about the kind of poetic shock and reversal in this carrego we could all ignite if we claimed our ways of playing, our ways of telling stories, our ways of writing letters to one another, drawing images of the not yet. What would happen if we cleaned our brushes, if we wiped our camera lenses, if we heated our welding tools, recovered our songs, filled our confined spaces with pulsating bodies that are not afraid to reinvent grammars of playfulness and ritual to heal all of our relations. Art, you see, has a tremendous power to make all of this possible. It allows us to connect with ourselves so we can access what is hidden in our deepest recesses in very embodied, striking, and visceral ways. From rage to grief to wonder, the arts help us touch, sense, name our emotions, educate our affections, while inspiring us to resist, to agitate, to heal, to connect, to conjure, to generate tools for speculative imagination and also for integration of embodied and intellectual knowledge. It is a site for world making, for dreaming, for rehearsing, and choreographing new possibilities of being and interweaving in the world. When we immerse ourselves in acts of creation, we have access to the visceral, the somatic life of the body, reflections, limits, intuition, answers, desires, needs. We can begin to weave the invisible back into what's perceptible. Art also has the power to evoke and to create other possible worlds. And because of art's power to evoke and to provoke, we are able to sit with this trouble, to lean into instability, to practice unlearning, and to affirm our inherent capacity to be at once problematic and prophetic. Art, the stories of our ancestors, the production of artists, they all keep our spiritual practices alive and help us create a collective vision for humanity that resists the imperial violence of domination. They anchor us in a politic of love that seeks justice through radical relationality, collectivity, creativity, vulnerability, mutual consideration, and potential becoming undone in affection and tenderness. Gloria Anzaldúa often wrote about how artists and images and histories help us access our knowledge, our roots, our strength, our remedy, what colonialism forced us to lose, to forget, to discard, lo que nos robaron. Arte cambia el punto de referencia, as she writes it. We create art to find the sound of the genuine, as Howard Thurman puts it too. And cultural workers like Fabiana Rodriguez, Sonali Balaji have been thinking in similar ways to Alves, naming that we are at a juncture in which we must learn to integrate arts and embodied belonging so that we can heal and we can continue to hope. In her essay, An Evolutionary Roadmap for Belonging and Co-Liberation, Balaji proposes a framework for addressing these urgencies through small actions and connections. By constructing spaces of belonging that are rooted in love, in stillness, so there's the rest, in beholding, and also becoming. Through the work of love, we're able to cultivate affection and openness as ways of expanding care for our bodies, our communities, and the land. Through the practice of stillness, we can begin to slow down our nervous systems, sustaining our capacity to be whole as we continue to do the work of disassembling the massive, massive crises that we're living through. By beholding, we can begin to expand our small circles of care into larger ones. Capitalism and supremacy cannot take root in decolonial spaces where deep witnessing, deep regard exists. So this exchange of intimate regard allows us to identify where the violence is circulating, where power is hidden or abused, misused to exterminate, to other, to exclude. And the small practices of becoming, they support emergence, mutuality, and an orientation toward creative wonder. And this is where the arts kind of come in. Our bodies have indeed experienced too much, too fast, and too soon this past year. And I ask myself how much of our academic spaces could benefit from engaging with this framework, right? As an attempt to respond to the profound collective shifts, the disempowerment, and the trauma that COVID-19 has imparted on us. How might we exercise hope while incorporating experiences of presence, of love, of rest, of stillness, witnessing, and becoming in gatherings such as this one? Perhaps a first important step would be to acknowledge that many of us are dealing with experiences of anxiety, withdrawal, grief, preoccupation. We are metabolizing trauma and are dealing with several forms of material and spiritual insecurities. How can we design encounters that are premised on regard and beholding, even in the face of this continuing pandemic? Or white supremacy, or militarism, or anti-Black racism, violence, war, genocidal governments, continued exposure to abuse and violence that continues to wound us deeply. So tending to the ways in which these traumas interact and show up in our communities is a way to take seriously the impact these realities have on our body, spirit, place, time. This is a term that Patricia Gonzalez, a Chicano indigenous scholar, uses and coined actually to evidence that we are an undivided unit made up of bodies, of places we take root in, the spirit that guides us, and the lifetimes contained in our stories. So she uses it as one word: body, spirit, place, time. And as Resma Menakem points out, our bodies and brains have this great capacity to learn, to undergo transformation, to grow, to heal. While trauma, he writes, can inhibit and block this capacity, once trauma has been addressed, growth and positive change can become possible again. So just as trauma and viruses spread, so too can affection, regard, presence spread as well. Because of art's power to evoke, to create, and to reveal these patterns and meanings and thoughts, really, I have found the act of engaging with the arts to be incredibly helpful in elaborating the anxieties that emerge from various threats to our existence. Artistic practices are never too far from what matters most in life. They have a profound ability to put us in touch with a creative impulse, to offer us insights into our own interiorities, and to move us spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually toward ourselves, toward one another, and toward our lands, and toward the divine. Artistic manifestations allow us to access and connect individually and collectively to what is meaningful, potentially generative, and ultimately transformative. It's less about fully understanding the world as such and more about being alert to discover the opportunities that the world offers us. We must awaken, and art helps us do that. Julia Kristeva describes this aesthetic awakening with a reminder that our bodies must take part in experiences with art, not only to contemplate the art, but to sense it. She writes that the ultimate aim of art is perhaps what was formerly celebrated under the term incarnation, to incarnate, to put it in our carne, our bodies, our flesh, to enflesh. I mean by that, she writes, I mean by that a wish to make us feel a real experience in the body through lines, the colors, the sensations, textures, etc. Sometimes, Alves affirms, life has to lay dormant for years, buried within our sepulchres. Sometimes life only has a chance after death. So in the midst of the death that surrounds our days, weeks, months, and the millions of lives lost to COVID, I would like to share with you the work of two artists that I believe have been activating and resuscitating life from the torpor of the last 2 years. They have found ways to create, reanimate, and mobilize audiences even in the face of impossibility. And I am going to share with you my screen because I want you to actually see their works of art. Welcome to my messy desktop. Let's see. So the first artist that I would like to share with you today is Vanessa German. They describe themselves as a citizen artist who centers the exploration of human technologies that respond to the ongoing catastrophes of structural racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, source extraction, and misogynoir, end quote. German creates art in all kinds of languages, in all kinds of emanations. You can find her work as sculptures, performance, communal rituals, installation, photography, And part of what she's trying to do, to quote her, is to repair and reshape disrupted human systems, spaces, and connections. As a self-taught citizen artist working across sculpture, performance, and ritual, and immersive installations, and sometimes photography too, in order to repair and reshape disrupted systems and spaces, her practice proposes new models for social healing, for utilizing creativity and tenderness as vital forces to reckon with the historical and our society's most pernicious violences. In this work entitled Blue Walk, and these are photographs taken by the photographer Tojo Andrianarivo. Thank you for letting me use these images. She stages what she names a spectacle of love. She allows audiences and performers to touch, sense, engage with feelings that are very often suppressed. In the context of this pandemic and other struggles we have endured because of these interlocking systems of oppression, German performances allow us to actually metabolize this grief, this rage, and partake in experiences of tenderness and even rest. This particular pilgrimage was staged in July in Portland during the time-based art festival that was organized by the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art. The artists and the group of performers that you see right behind them walked through a historically Black neighborhood, acknowledging how gentrification impacted the social ecologies within the city. So as participants walked through the neighborhood, they were able to sense firsthand and see our own sense in our own flesh, how gentrification and marginalization has generated housing insecurity, the displacement and uprooting of Black bodies from the stretch of land. And participants were invited to walk, and here I quote in full the artist's statement because it's so profoundly beautiful. It's part of the performance as well. In the power of the blues, moving in the power of water, creativity, dimensional wholeness. The ritual is the goodbye song and the lifting up song. We learned this in a short period of togetherness pre-ritual. These songs are about listening, giving permission to the voice and the body, taking up space and sky. This ritual was intended to really inscribe in our bodies, our minds, our souls, the holiness of the Black body in the living planet. As a healing channel of release and power, the Blue Walk is an activation of collective soul. It honors simultaneity of time. It's a cleansing and a bringing up. It is a sob and a glory song. We are the power source. Vanessa German reminds me of the power of Rubem Alves' story and what he tried to do with his poetics. They're written into my body as German's performance and storytelling has created an enfleshed and mental topography of rituals that mediate and take into account all of the ways in which we have been mourning, yearning, longing, and desiring healing. Through this storytelling, through this mixed media, assemblage of bodies and textile, German mediated ritual and collective acts of togetherness to reclaim the right of Black people to share in power, spirituality, and presence. As non-Black participants were invited to witness and to be mindfully present, we were extending loving kindness, and we had to sit with the ways in which we internalize and externalize in our actions anti-Blackness in our relationships, in our lives. Based in Pittsburgh, German's art practice is intertwined with this inseparable part of her activism and her community leadership. She's founded the Love Front Porch, an arts initiative for women, children, and families of the local neighborhood to uphold art making as an act of restorative justice. And that pervaded this performance in Portland. As a queer Black woman living in the United States, German has described this as a deeply necessary process of venturing into the wild freedom that the inhabitation of such identity demands. This activist instinct emerges in German's work to postulate powerful narratives of Black freedom and love, even in the face of extreme violence and derealization. Very powerful images here from her blue walk across, and also claiming their spiritual practices as well. The other and last artist, and I'm coming to the end of my talk, is also through art created a space for people to come together, even in the face of most painful times and spaces. Her name is Lygia Clark. You see her right on your right side of the screen, a Brazilian artist born in 1927. She staged a collective mobilization with her work during some of the most difficult years in Brazilian history. She was an influential sculptor in the 60s and 70s, and very deeply critical of the Brazilian dictatorship and state repression that assailed our country from 64 to 85. And her work probed the limits of sensorial psychological experiences. This work that you see on the left is called Divisor. It's one of her best known works, and it's at once performance and sculpture, and was performed in Rio during the military coup. And during this time, people were prohibited from gathering out in the streets, but she composed a piece for the people to do just that, to occupy public spaces and conspire for freedom underneath this large mantle. It's a cotton fabric, 30-meter white cotton fabric in the shape of a square, and the piece has 200 holes symmetrically perforated the fabric where the viewers can actually wear the sculpture collectively. So once 200 participants, are properly positioned, they're invited to enact a procession while wearing the artwork. See, these two artists are weaving webs over our voids. Papi's white fabric reposes over the shoulder of the participants and isolates the rest of the body, so you can't really see what's underneath. So it collapses boundaries and weaves webs across the abysses of class, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, corporeal ability, and so much more. As bodies move through the streets of Rio here, or for example, this was a staging in São Paulo, but this was a staging in New York. Literally wearing the sculpture, they're summoned to integrate their bodies, enjoy a cloud of witnesses. A multitude of people unified by what takes on shape as undulating waves. So the theme of water is also here again. And a procession, public procession, seizing back the freedom, even if momentarily. Marked within the skin of this divisor is a renewal of commitment towards justice and hope. And for the translators, I'm skipping a little bit ahead because I know we're almost out of time. So let me just show you some more images here. I like to use Mayra Rivera's naming that this is an imbrication of bodies in the fabric of the world. I think that describes this artwork very well. So what works of art such as these require of us is what Rubem Alves names as an awakening of sorts, an education of our senses capable of conjuring new worlds into being, weaving new webs over the voids before us. And when I engage with Papi or German's work, I am reminded of Alves' stories and reflections on seashells, oysters, and beauty. Struck in awe by the beauty of the shells, he sought to decipher the enigma of oysters. He found out that oysters are not only competent engineers who built houses so their soft, tender bodies would have shelter from the most threatening predators in treacherous environments. Alves saw them as architects and artists. Before works of art take form, they exist virtually in the soul of the artist. Before the beautiful seashells take form, he writes, they exist in the soul of the oysters. So life, he ruminates, doesn't only engender useful objects, adequate tools for survival. Life does not only want to survive. Life wants to flow, fluir, wants to move toward joy, toward that which nurtures our senses of hope, capacity to imagine otherwise. Our bodies, he affirms, need more than bread to survive. We're hungry for beauty, for connection, for belonging, for acolhimento. Our eyes, our senses also need to be nourished and fed. And the works of art surveyed today allow for an education of our affections and sensibilities to take place. bearing an invitation to mourn, to move in deep regard, reverence, and entanglement. As the gossamer of German and Papi and Alves continue to envelop and surround us, it becomes ever clearer to me that the arts do have a vibrant capacity to awaken what is dormant in us. Awaken dormant dreams. They invite co-weaving of cross threads, even in the face of impossibility, negation, and derealization. These artists carry a vast and complex bodies of thought that orient us toward liberation, reverence, and living life as a sacred and ritualized act of common union. And by collectively witnessing the work of these artists, we open up the capacity to relate deeply and respectfully across the differences, while maintaining receptivity to the unknown, to borrow Laura Perez's language. Inherently polyvalent, the arts have a tremendous power to connect, unsettle that which is hidden in us, and as sites for world making and choreographing new possibilities of being, the arts are capable of cultivating in us an orientation, an openness toward wonder, mystery, and that which we have othered. The pandemic and the ensuing uprisings, the incapacity of governments to decently respond to the urgencies of our times have impacted us in ways that we cannot fully grasp at the moment. It is my hope that these reflections sparked in us a desire to co-weave with the divine imaginative webs over our voids. Muito, muito, muito obrigada. A big hug to all of you who are participating, and thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Juncker. I believe that everybody, wherever they are at this point, they are giving you a big hand. We are so thankful, so grateful for this amazing presentation, discussion, art showing, something that is enriched so much this event and what we can make of these conversations. I see both you and Professor Keefe-Perry as the younger generation pushing Alves forward, bringing Alves to new dialogues, to new conversations. And I think you showed that to us right now, and I'm sure that that will come up in the conversation that we'll have afterwards. But without taking much time, because we also want to hear the second talk, we have today with us Professor Callid Keefe-Perry. He's an assistant professor of contextual education and public theology at the Boston College School for Theology and Ministry. He's a practical theologian whose teaching and research orbit around explorations of imagination, creativity, and education as a site of human and societal formation. He is the author of Way to Water, a theopoetics primer, which features Alves' work significantly. Callid currently serves as the Assistant Director of the Religion and Education Collaborative, an international network of interdisciplinary scholars and practitioners who study at the intersection of schools, religion, and spirituality. Callid is also an acknowledged minister in the Religious Society of Friends Quakers. So welcome, Callid. We look forward to hearing from you too.
Thank you for that warm welcome. I'll begin in the pattern following Yohanna to say that I'm here just north of Boston on the land traditionally and still occupied by the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. So recognizing that that is a relevant thing in these times in the United States, especially want to begin with that recognition. Today, I'm going to share with you some thoughts, especially related to a particular essay that Alves wrote in the late 60s, early 70s, that was mentioned earlier. God is dead, long live God. So you can kind of imagine this as a duet with some of Alves' own writing. So the title today is kind of a tricky one in both English and Portuguese. A saudade that doesn't be sated, saciada, God, utopia, and the sensible transcendent. And to begin, I want to kind of name this this phrase from Alves, which will kind of resonate throughout much of this talk. He says, theology is not the thing of those who believe in God, but those who have saudade for God. Theology is not the thing of those who believe in God, but those who have saudade for God. While the consequences of COVID-19 continue to garner news attraction, the fact is that this pandemic is joining others that have persisted for years. In the context of the United States, at least, the last 2 years has seen the rise of the term triple pandemic to refer to the overlapping realities of coronavirus, white supremacy, and ecological crisis. While I'm uncertain if this is true in other countries, though I would guess there are some resonances, in the United States, it is sensible to refer to these as related. For example, though the viral pandemic has been hard for many, data shows that COVID-19 has had a disproportionately negative impact on Black and Latinx households, both in terms of health and being more at risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19 as well. And they're more likely to be impacted by economics and more likely to lose income and experience difficulty paying rent or making mortgage payments. Also, research suggests that the impact of ongoing climate change has already and will continue to disproportionately impact people of color in the United States. I mention these not to signal a paper full of sociological data, but to point out that the era of the pandemic will not end with vaccination. Our struggles and diseases run far deeper than a virus. Consequently, our longing for its end will be more prolonged, a fact that makes the contributions of Rubem Alves all the more relevant. As many people here will know, the feeling of saudade was central to the theological work of Alves. If you know Portuguese, you know the feeling of saudade in your body. For others, this word is a challenge to translate. As far as I know, it does not have an exact translation in English or in Italian or Spanish. It's a kind of infinite longing, but it's pointed and rending. It's not abstract at all. Alves says that it is the feeling close to nostalgia, but saudade is always saudade of a scenario, of a face, of a scene, of a time. It's the feeling of straightening up the room of a son who just died. It is the presence of an absence. Reading an essay like God is Dead, Long Live God is an exercise, I would say, in theological saudade. In this essay, I want to consider some of the implications of Alves' thinking alongside the work of feminist theologian Grace Jansen, the consequences of which I think can provide a fertile ground for future work. First, I want to explore some of the ways in which Alves' emphasis on saudade can be seen to be intimately related to his thinking about utopia and imagination. And then interpreting those topics with the use of Jansen will show the importance to paying attention to bodies and materiality in the ways in which positive concern for embodiment and particularity invite us into greater flourishing and engagement with suffering. And Alves' claim that theology is not the thing of those who believe in God, but of those who have saudade for God, we can see a neat braid of his use of saudade and the role that the death of God scholarship plays in his thinking. Far from a God of certainty and determination, Alves envisions a God of invitation and of possibility. He says, the symbol of God articulates a messianic experience of history, an interpretation of time in its future dimension as a time of promise, a time of liberation, time as an invitation. Such an interpretation generates a global vision in which creation itself is understood as a function of history and not simply as what precedes it. Nature is thus subordinated to freedom. I want to suggest that one of the ways to think about this time as invitation idea is to consider the concept of utopia as the source of theological saudade. The no place that is a utopia is the presence of an absence, as in saudade, and it functions to invite us, to pull us towards a goal that we will never reach. I have found a comparison from mathematics that I actually think is useful when considering this idea. I won't go into the details of it here, but I want to show you what I'm talking about because I think sometimes the visuals help. So there is this word, a math word, asymptote, asymptota, and if you graph a graph in math, some of them, if you look at this little red line, will go off forever to the right and forever to the top. But if you take that little equation, y equals 1 over x, and graph it, there's never an end to that line. The line that's going up, the red line going up, gets closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to touch that line. And the red line that's going over gets closer and closer and closer, but they never touch. Another way to think about it is they only touch at infinity. Only at the end of all numbers, right? Only at infinity do those two lines ever cross. That in math is what we call an asymptote. And I think that that's useful because to some degree, there's a relationship between that and the way that we think about utopia. In mathematics, we call that a limit. The utility of this piece of math as metaphor is that even though we know that line will never actually touch, we still talk about that line in relation to the thing it never reaches. Though it never arrives, we do say that curve is approaching the axis. Asymptotes are the places that are never reached, but we name them as if they do. Asymptotes allow us to refer to the place where an intersection would occur at infinity, but never arrives in actuality. This is how I think about utopia functioning in theology, especially liberation theology, and especially Alvesian liberation theology. We use it to describe where we are heading, but will never quite reach. How, though, does this intersection that never arrives help us think about theology in the present? And what does it have to do with utopias? This is a place, one place at least, where I think Grace Jansen is useful. Jansen discusses the idea of utopia significantly, and she often engages it in a discussion of the ways that classical Greek war literature, like Homer, became a foundation to the Western patriarchal imagination, and it was preoccupied, she says, with death. She also recalls the poet Sappho, who was also prolific and also Greek, but whose work has been eclipsed by Homer, in part because she was a woman. Thus, she says, Men whose heroic violence and investment in early glorious death was taken as the ideal of beauty and excellence. It did not have to be that way, and it does not need to stay that way, says Jansen. Though Sapphic literatures from Sappho, did not become the bedrock of Western thought, Sappho's presence persists as a kind of echoing possibility of what might have been and might yet be. Jansen says, quote, fragments remain, and in their very fragmentary and jagged nature, they disrupt smooth narrative of Western self-constitution. We cannot undo the history of the West, but by challenging its alleged inevitability, by looking as far as we can down the roads not taken, we can become clearer about the ways power and knowledge have forged a violent and deathly narrative that could have been otherwise. Sappho's voice, although repressed, was not wholly erased, and it can serve as the seed from which we can begin to dream what an alternative history might be. In utopian hope, looking as far as we can down the roads not taken yields an asymptote. Utopia is what we must approach if we are to change. At the limits of our longing, we encounter life abundant. Jansen reminds the reader that, politically speaking, the vision for positive change has been presented as a utopia, and she reiterates the Greek etymology of utopia, which literally means it is no place, utopia. A utopia, she says, does not exist and perhaps never could. I suggest that it is precisely because a utopia is unattainable, because it is asymptotic and beyond contact, that when one turns to look down the road towards it, one's sight must extend beyond the present. Utopia is the place from which real alternatives can be imagined. Alves makes a similar claim about religion itself when he wrestles with Feuerbach. He says, this is why even your fantasies and dreams make sense. They contain the secret of human transcendence, your protest against the human condition as it is. So, if religion is a dream of the human mind, and if God is an actor that the mind creates to work in this theater of the imagination, it is the encrypted message that the essence of humanity, the humankind that may come with the future, is directed towards the humankind that exists in the present. Even if religion is a dream of the human mind and God is an actor that the mind creates, the fact remains that our time spent in this theater of imagination brings us often to an encounter with something which invites us into what we can become. This is why Alves says that the intellectual problem of the death of God is not the sad task of grave diggers in eternity, but is instead a challenge to discover the new forms of human experience that, although in a germinal way, are beginning to express themselves. Just as Sappho's voice can serve as the seed from which we can begin to dream, so too can God of the imagination's theater. The idea which never arrives still shapes our motion in the present. The question is, how does this happen? I think of imagination in spatial terms as the place in the middle where our ideas of now and later both live. It is the overlap between how we interpret the present and how we think the future might be. Imagination is the home of interpretation. Alves writes that imagination is not an instrument of clairvoyance made for revealing the secrets of the future or of another world. It's a mirror. The impossible it reflects is the impossible that is actually lived. The secret of utopias is thus the reality from which they grow. What we find in our imagination, especially as we ask what we imagine that God wants for us in the world, can be transformative. Seeds of the future are nourished in the imagination of the present. However, they are not brought to fruition through promises and predictions, but through practice and through play. The work of Bruno Linares that he's done on Alves is incredibly insightful on this point. So many thanks to Bruno for that work. He says, quote, "Imagination fuels pleasure by allowing play even with a subversion of established rules, and as a result, new solutions for situations in life can be found. Imagination also forms a utopian image of the future. It is in the forming of the idea of a future transformed by hope that possible changes may be attempted. For this reason, magic rituals, play, and utopian dreams should not be considered symptoms of sickness as much as they might be seen as values that are not seen as functional, pragmatic, or real by Western civilization. Alves seeks, in other words, to imagine the birth of a new culture. Since the world is not yet complete because God is still exercising creative powers, the present time of captivity is not a time of birth, but a time of the conception of a community of faith." Quote. What Alves sees in utopian thought is decidedly not some transcendent blueprint for a perfect society, but it is instead an invitation and an inspiration for something new. This is about hope and change far more than it is about certainty and promise. It is not the inevitable hope of a Marxist revolution or the Christian eschatological hope of millennial dispensationalism. It is a hope far less determined than either of those and far more precarious and contingent. It is a hope that requires play and fleshly particularity. Once again, I think Jansen is useful here. For her, hope can only be found in the particularities of actual bodies and an actual planet. I'm reminded here now of Yohanna's naming of the body, spirit, place, time. Actual bodies and an actual planet. Where history is concerned, certainty requires the kind of abstraction which makes it harder to pay attention to the particulars. Jansen makes this point through some significant engagement with the work of Luce Irigaray and the concept of the sensible transcendent. Discussing the trajectory of a person who perceives beauty, loves it, and by uniting with it, touches the divine, Jansen quotes Irigaray, who says that such a person would have attained what I call the sensible transcendental, the material texture of beauty. Beauty itself is seen as that which confounds the opposition between immanence and transcendence. It's an already, always sensible horizon through which everything else would appear. Jansen draws a parallel to her own project, noting that beauty cannot be detached and float free from the physical matter of a painting or sculpture, nor can transcendence float free of its sensible configuration. The transcendental and the immanent are not to be seen as opposites. Rather, the sensible transcendental, the pantheistic projection of the female divine, opens out, bringing the God to live through us. Quote. Jansen argues that when transcendence and immanence are conceived as opposites, the consequence is a stagnation of the possible. Drawing on Irigaray, she suggests that philosophically maintaining the split is part of what gives rise to mind-body dualism, the combative situating of logic and reason over and against affect and sensation. These schisms, in turn, privilege mind over body, order over chaos, culture over nature, and result in what she says is the masculine codified in the objective rational realm of intellectualized reality, and the feminine bound to the sphere of matter and materiality. In short, part of the power underlining patriarchy is the epistemological consequences of a transcendence that is wholly other from the material and immanent. Framing the transcendent as radically other dismisses the ways in which the present can serve as a conduit for the new. For Irigere, religion itself was one of the main ways that masculine symbolic maintains itself as a source of woman disempowering authority. Jansen shares Irigere's discontent, but her tact is recuperative rather than dismissive. Much of her later work is an attempt to transform religion rather than to jettison it. At a broad level, this transformation consists of replacing the notion of God as an all-powerful super being in a timeless realm with the notion of the divine as a divine horizon for human becoming. The notion of the sensible transcendent suggests that within the finite material present, it is possible to experience the arcing curve towards that future that never arrives. I'm reminded of Paulo Freire here. He says that we can always continue to become more like what we are meant to be. The ontological vocation of humanity is self-humanization, to seek out deeper ways of being, to search for being more, o ser mais. There is no end to the roads that we can look down. Attention must be paid to the particulars of circumstances, not just because justice demands full address of material conditions, though it does, but also because it is in materiality and particularity and relationality that we come to be who we are. Alves affirms something similar in a reflection on Feuerbach's thinking. I found my ideas in materials that can be apprehended only through my senses, he says. If we consent, our bodies can partner with imagination to serve as seed beds of the future. Alves says, the triumphalist optimism of the Enlightenment is not allowed. There are not many certainties. However, there are invitations. There is fundamentally an unbounded affirmation of life, the body, future. In some way, this world of mad people is transfigured before the hope of what it can become, only if humanity is willing to build it. In mathematics, the name for the shape where two circles overlap, it has a particular name. They call it vices pisces. But in Italian, it's mandorla or almond. It's the same word that we use in art history to describe the shape. So that space in the middle where two circles overlap, that's the almond. And mandorla is the same word we use to describe that radiance that surrounds the Virgin Mary, or here, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the image of Mary that appeared in a series of visions to Juan Diego, the 16th century peasant in Tepec, Mexico. It's also used throughout the iconography of the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church, where that almond, mandorla, is used to depict those sacred moments that somehow are a place of transcendence and time being broken open, the resurrection and the transfiguration of the Christ. It's a symbol of overlap and saturation of moments that are so full that they spill out over beyond themselves into something more. Just as beauty cannot be detached and float free from the physical matter of a painting or sculpture, so too does imagination have its roots in the present. How we imagine God and imagine the world that God is inviting us into is shaped by what we have seen and sensed. However, it is not limited to only what has come before. Our imagination is the space of overlap, a seedbed that can nourish ideas of change in the soil of the present. If imagination is the seedbed of change, then hope, I would say, is movement towards utopia. Because we can both cry, God is dead and long live God, we can also say utopia will never arrive. Let us move towards utopia. But when we do this, we must do it not with abstraction, finality, or the sense that the perfect system has been found. Never that. Our movement must be one that sees small things, that recognizes that taking in the experience of others and the world can open out into the infinite. Alves says, Hope is a beautiful thing, which I love, but it lives within subjectivity, which is interior things. And this was not enough for me. I did not just want to keep hoping. I wanted to be able to perceive the signs of its possible realization in the lives of individuals and communities. Dreams of gardens were not enough for me. It was necessary to know which gardens could and would be planted. Love of gardens had to become a gardening manual. Hope had to express itself as politics. The invitation we name as God is to live into a flourishing that must be found by trying and failing and trying again. Dreams of gardens are not sufficient, but these dreams are the seeds of action. Hope is not about waiting for something that is certain, but moving in the face of uncertainty. Not blueprints for a cold and distant perfection, a manual for political action, a guide to gardening. I'd add, protest in the streets. Why does Alves proclaim, "Long live God," after saying God is dead? He does so lest the death of God seems so final that the present overtakes the possible. It is true that Alves asks us to turn away from the certainty of the God of promises. He says, "Whoever knows the secret of the sacred name, a name that cannot be pronounced, the name of God, well, that person also knows that everything else cannot be sacred." So he wants to say it's true that turning away from certainty can itself be too certain. The triumphalist optimism of the Enlightenment is not allowed. There aren't many certainties, he says. There's a way of looking at the declaration of the death of God as a kind of inverted apocalyptic. Interpretations of the death of God framed as the final truth or ultimate vision look an awful lot like religious revelation. I think Alves was sensitive to this inversion and wished to transform it. Not theism over the death of God or atheism over faith, not transcendence over immanence or immanence over transcendence. Even for those of us who are Christian, we can say that the final truth has not arrived. How could it have? Perhaps God is the Alpha and the Omega, and in the city of New Jerusalem there is no temple, for the temple is the Lord. But we are a people of in-betweenness. The God of the certain end has not arrived today. We are invited to what comes next by a God that is still making. In a time of pandemics, many will want to turn from the pain. To those who need to turn for their own healing and mental health, I think we are faithful to encourage them to find respite. However, for those of us that can, I think it is vital we continue to look at and know suffering. Alves himself reminds us that what the biblical symbols clearly indicate is that the body of God, the body of the liberator, is the body of the oppressed and dispossessed. And it is from solidarity and suffering that the future is imagined. No saudade. Taste it. God longs for a future for us that has not arrived. We are invited by Deus de sensibilidade to look out into the present and to see there the future already ready to burst forth. To look at soil and see a home for seeds. Yes, the dreams of a garden, but also the politics of garden building. There are invitations. There is an unbounded affirmation of life, of the body, of future. Theology is not the thing of those who believe in God, but of those who have saudade for God. And those who have saudade for God should be attentive because each day may have invitations. Waking up in the morning, the smell of coffee, baking with my daughter, prayer, silence, hope, work, rest, and walking the road.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Callid, this is another thought-provoking presentation. I think there is so much food for thought, for conversation in these two amazing talks. And we have already some questions coming in. And what I will do right now is to give you a couple of minutes to put your questions on in the chat and make sure that the questions will get to us. And we will have a short video presentation which was organized by Professor Raimundo called the Theopoetical video, a conversation with Rubem Alves and conversation with Rubem Alves and Tom Jobim. So let's see that, and while we also enjoy this artistic presentation, we will continue to collect the questions, and we will engage in a few minutes. We'll engage the two speakers today. Thank you so much, Yohanna. Thank you very much, Callid.
Tristeza não tem fim. Tristeza não.
Pandemias acontecem quando uma doença sai do seu lugar de origem e contagia uma grande região geográfica. Às vezes pode até alcançar o planeta todo. A palavra pandemia vem dos termos gregos pan e demos. Pan quer dizer todos, e demos quer dizer povo. Todo o povo, todo mundo, o mundo todo. Peste bubônica, cólera, varíola, gripe espanhola, AIDS, H1N1, coronavírus. Muita gente morre nas pandemias. Em tempos pandêmicos, o medo é pandemia, a dor é pandemia, o sofrimento é pandemia, a saudade é pandemia. Em tempos pandêmicos, a finitude é passada na cara, a transitoriedade é escancarada, a morte é soco no estômago. Bate uma sensação de derrota, às vezes. É como naquela canção de Tom e Vinícius: tristeza não tem fim, felicidade sim.
A felicidade é como a pluma que o vento vai levando pelo ar. Voa tão leve, mas tem a vida breve, precisa que haja vento sem parar. A felicidade do pobre parece a grande ilusão do carnaval. A gente trabalha o ano inteiro por um momento de sonho pra fazer a fantasia de rei ou de pirata ou jardineira. E tudo se acabar na quarta-feira.
A felicidade é como o carnaval. A gente se ilude para depois voltar às cinzas, ao pó da terra, ao barro, que é de onde viemos, segundo a Bíblia. Quarta-feira de cinzas. Parece que a vida contém a morte. Ou será que é a morte que contém a vida? Tem uma história do Gabriel Garcia Marques que Rubem Alves conta. É sobre o corpo morto de um homem afogado no mar que chega boiando nas ondas a uma pequena aldeia. Ele não tem nome, ninguém o conhece, mas é preciso enterrá-lo. As mulheres da aldeia vão então preparar o corpo para o sepultamento. Há um grande silêncio ao redor do corpo, um silêncio sepulcral, como se fala. Mas de repente, do meio da morte, uma ressurreição tem início. Uma das mulheres comentou: "Nossa, que mãos grandes ele tem! Quantas guerras essas mãos lutaram! Quantas mulheres acariciaram!" comentou outra. E começaram a imaginar como ele era alto, como teria sido sua voz. E da imaginação soprou um vento de vida. Os homens, por sua vez, ficaram enciumados e invejaram o morto, que conhecia um mundo para eles desconhecido. Presos que estavam na aldeia. Sofriam de uma prisão espiritual, epidêmica e epidérmica. Epidêmica porque localizada nas fronteiras do que se conhece, e epidérmica porque superficial, sem profundidade. Dias velhos, velhos hábitos, palavras vazias, gestos vazios. O defunto os desinstalava. O homem foi finalmente enterrado, mas seu corpo morto renovou a vida da aldeia. Novos dias foram então possíveis. Precisamos, afinal, sempre novamente esperançar, imaginar horizontes, da graça criativa e iludida dos sonhos. Etimologicamente, ilusão pertence à esfera da brincadeira, do jogo, do ludus. Iludir-se é deixar-se criar. Disso depende o futuro. Abrir as janelas e deixar o vento entrar. É como na canção: A pluma precisa de ventos e amanheceres.
A felicidade é como a gota de orvalho numa pétala de flor. Brilha tranquila, depois de leve oscila e cai como uma lágrima de amor. A minha felicidade está sonhando nos olhos da minha namorada. É como essa noite passando, passando em busca da madrugada. Fala embaixo, por favor, pra que ela acorde alegre como o dia, oferecendo beijos de amor.
Do silêncio da noite, à beira do abismo, um vento bravo, uma madrugada e o amanhecer. Janelas e portas abertas, peito aberto, cabeça aberta, horizontes. Os teólogos falam de um Deus abscônditos, misterioso, escondido, esquecido, como um estranho. Há, afinal, algo de misterioso e divino em um dia que amanhece com beijos de amor. Uma palavra ancestral é pronunciada a cada vez que esse dia se faz. Uma melodia antiquíssima é tocada e cantada. Uma canção que todos conhecem, todo o povo. Pan demos. Se a morte é certa, também são certas a vida e sua renovação. Andar com fé eu vou, que a fé não costuma falhar, disse o poeta. Ou como em outra canção de Jobim.
É de manhã, vem o sol, mas os pingos da chuva que ontem caiu ainda estão a brilhar, ainda estão a dançar ao vento alegre que me traz esta canção. Quero que você me dê a mão, vamos sair por aí, sem pensar no que foi que sonhei, que chorei, que sofri, pois a nossa manhã já me fez esquecer. Me dê a mão, vamos sair pra ver o sol.
Sair por aí sem pensar que chorei, que sofri, vamos ver o sol. Se a morte retém a vida retém a morte. O sol é o protesto da vida forçando a passagem. A beleza é sinal. A palavra é poder. Pan demos para todo mundo. Esperança é pandemia. Sonho é pandemia. Sabedoria é pandemia. Alegria é pandemia. Tudo o que queremos para todos na rua de novo. Tudo do mais simples, do mais corriqueiro. Tudo que temos saudade. Pradaria, calmaria, correria, academia, padaria, sorveteria, euforia, choperia, boemia, bateria, pizzaria, cachaçaria, hospedaria, polissemia. A vida é pandemia para todos.
Wow, there is so much in this video. Yeah, it would lead to a discussion of itself in itself. So thank you so much, Anna. This is a beautiful piece of art, and we're so grateful to have you among us and to just benefit from these artistic gifts that you bring. We have some time for questions, and we have already a few questions here in the chat. Some of the questions in Portuguese, one of them is in English, some are, so I could either read the questions for you, or how do you want to do Yohanna and Callid, do you want to read the questions yourself and respond, or have me reading the questions? It's up to you, especially the ones in Portuguese. If you want me to read, I could do that. Otherwise, feel free to engage with the questions. I have three questions that I see, and a fourth one that just has come. While you were looking at the questions, let me say this. Both of your works are fascinating because I think you are taking the hand of Rubem Alves and walking him through paths that he himself could not imagine. By introducing him to new partners of conversations and introducing his work and his, I would say, his capacity to bring some of this imagination to being so early in time to bear on conversations that are so meaningful today. So both of you are doing this. I myself have questions about that, but let's see if we can engage some of the questions that have been asked by those who are participating here. And I'm sure that there will be time for further conversation following this. I think the first question was addressed to Yohanna. Thanks, Yohanna, for a beautiful.
Should I respond? Should I respond to that in English?
I think everything, because it's being recorded, should be in English. So that's why I'm trying to translate it here. So the question is, the blue and white webs that you presented to us as ways to embrace our abysses, in what sense are they related to the webs of religion, which, according to Alves, are also human bridges over the abysses of life? In what sense are they similar? How are they distinguished? Or are they the same in only the sight of oppressive bodies?
What a beautifully put question. What a poetic question. Yeah. Poetic way of asking that question. I do agree with the last sentence that it's one and the same of the sigh of bodies that are tired and that are oppressed. But I also think that these blue and white webs, they become visible signs of an absence in much the same way that religion and our spiritual traditions engage with signs as, you know, the sacraments, so to speak, so in symbols that make us think about a return, about that space that another question asked that moves both forward and backward in time, a longing for a future that's not yet actualized, and a past that we either want to return to or that we want to either reclaim or re-engage with or change. So symbols of conspiring, breathing with someone else together, right? The visible threads of the invisible. That is religion for me. And I think both of these works, they have that longing for something that is not yet, to rectify, not really rectify, but to work with and open up apertures and spaces where people can come together and breathe with one another, to share these symbols, these longing remembrances, and this hope that has no end, as Alves talks about, right? Clasping hands together to participate in an action of reconnection, revealing our dreams. My dream is a dream of togetherness. And I think the dreams of these two artists was also to create spaces, poetic spaces, to reclaim our sense of agency, but also to dream better dreams of the future, right? Dream of love and dream of togetherness and dream of a place that dignifies all of these bodies as opposed to just some of the bodies. And I think when we create symbols to speak of these dreams of love, we also have a promise of love in these works of art. We also have a desire for love in these works of art. And I think that's exactly where God dwells. And I think that's the intention, at least as I understand the reconnection that religare, that religion attempts to get into, or to grasp, or to bring closer to our embodied material reality. Anyway, where I was going with that is that I think that's where God lives and dwells, is in both love and the absence, when both love and absence come together. So I think these two works of art kind of are manifestations of that, in a sense. This is what I can come up with at this moment, but this is an excellent question. I think that's a suggestion where part of this conversation can continue to move into, maybe towards the space of the sacrament and the symbols more explicitly than I did in these 30 minutes. Thank you for the question, Edsel.
Thank you for making so much of it, and a great response. Callid, in the context of the resurgence of conversation, of conservatism and fundamentalism in which we live, including in theology around the world, how have you been bringing Rubem Alves to theological and pastoral dialogue? Is there resistance, or there resistances? Are there openings? What do you find when you bring Rubem Alves to those contexts?
So I think I need to point towards folks like Yohanna more so than myself, in the sense that I think that when, like I did today, we take Alves's work and do theology with it, it actually is far less effective than actually doing the work, actually participating in art making, participating in that co-inspiration. And for those of us that live inside of the academy, there's always this wrestling of what does it mean to do written academic theology in a tone that is seen as legitimate, which Rubem himself decided to opt out of. And so, yes, I think that for thinking purposes, there is a great utility in his both and way of engaging with the world. However, ministerially, or in the actual cause of justice, I think that this kind of work is far less important than the kind of work that Yohanna has been a champion of, which is like doing the thing. I often think that sometimes was at my best when I owned a theater and was a performer and an actor, than when I was an academic who studied acting. And there is an irony there, of course. So I would say, for those of us who are engaging in the formal academy, I think there's work there in Alves that points the way towards some real incredible beauty and truth. But if I was forced to kind of choose, I actually think engaging in art practices, creative practice, is a far more important way of finding bridges and webs over voids than doing the academic work, even though that is what I do. And I think the importance is to then recognize that what do we need to do to be able to allow for that kind of work to count? So in my classrooms, I don't need people to write term papers. I can allow them to sculpt. I can allow them to sing. I can allow them to dance and count that. And that's the best that I've managed right now, is to kind of carve out these spaces in the academy where my students don't have to play those same games, to make that space so that they can kind of breathe and live in different ways than maybe I could have even 10 years ago.
Thank you. This is, I think, one of the big challenges in academic settings where we dialogue with these innovative thinkers like Alves, but we still many times we keep ourselves constrained to the formats and impositions of academic teaching and institutional requirements. So thank you for doing that and for pointing the way to us. There is a question here to both of you, and I will read them for you, and any of you can jump in and begin to answer. So the question with Yohanna and Callid is, who is this God, Rubem Alves, long live God? Okay, let me see it again. Who is this God, this long live God, from the dialects of God that is that we need to that needs to kill other gods, and that will resurrect, I believe, be reborn. We generally have a very clear idea of the God who must die. Rubens' no is always only pronounced in the dialect of a yes, as well as the dialect of freedom, and no goes to which massacres and oppresses, and immediately say yes to the creative, hopeful act. So denying God is easy, but how to say yes to those who will be born, to say live long to the new gods, as Rubem Alves knew so well.
This question also poetically and poignantly asked, to think about this, yet, like, to which I agree that denying God is easy, and it's harder to say what kind of God are we going to say yes to in the context of all the pernicious violences and massacres and annihilation and obliteration of life that we have been experiencing. It's much harder to say yes to a God in that context, if I'm understanding this question correctly. I think that the God that we say yes to is the God that needs bodies to overflow from, and to welcome, a God that hears and has the heart and cries and is in constant transformation in this relationship with humanity. So it's a God who laments, is a God who is able to be silently sitting and witnessing and being moved by our experiences, the God that can hold on to hands, the God that can be really in relationship with us. I think that's the God that we say yes to, not a faraway, unseen, mysterious, but one that fertilizes, because fertilizes our bodies, we can also fertilize the world, right? So it's that the God of the encounter. And it reminds me of that book that I was telling you all about at the beginning of my talk, the very first book that I ever held in my hands from Rubem Alves, Como Nasceu a Alegria, How Happiness Was Born. And the story, like the very profound theological story here for children, right? I was 5 when I had that story read to me. It's a very complex story. But in that book, there's a flower that was born with a different kind of petal, a very tiny flower that was born with a different kind of petal. And God the flower was so moved by the ways in which this little flower was encountered by others who had evil in their eyes. And this God cried and wept with the suffering of this tiny flower. And the tears fertilized the garden, and perfume was then engendered, sort of emerged in the context of this garden, and filled hearts in joy, with joyfulness. That's how happiness was born, was the perfume. But it was based in this experience of suffering, and this companionship, this God that's not intervening necessarily, but it's being modified, and it's giving itself, God's self, the divine self, to this experience of being affected by the experiences of humanity. And so that, I think, is the God that we're trying to affirm. This is the God that we're saying yes to. I hope that kind of gets to your question, Monica. I I find it hard. Like, I'm someone who ruminates with questions, and I tend to see things from the rear view mirror after typically I work this out in art, actually. So I just want to name that's hard for me to formulate thoughts because there's so many things kind of crossing my mind right now, but I hope I was able to make myself understood with this question, with this answer, this attempted working answer to the God that we say yes to.
I don't know if Callid wants to say something to this. There are two other questions for you, Callid, and one that I want to ask Yohanna. But if you want to say something about this question, go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right to say it's hard. I mean, one of the places I go to this is actually Freire, and this piece of Freire gets picked up by Gutierrez in Liberation, the first liberation book that Gutierrez wrote. But he says that any denouncing of the current order that doesn't also simultaneously announce that which is to come is a hollow critique. And he says any promise of what's to come that doesn't address oppressive conditions is a hollow promise. So Freire pushes us to say we need to, maybe not in the same breath, but like in the same moment or season of our lives, both do the pointing work of say, no, not this, but then also say, yes, this. And I'm reminded of my mentor is a woman named Melanie Duguid May, who really impressed it on me while I was in seminary, that in the first years of the church, when you said yes to Christ, you were saying no to Caesar. And that yes was a dangerous yes, because you couldn't say yes to both. And I think the test there, insofar as testing is even part of whatever the world is that's to come, is about, does this yield more flourishing? Is there greater love and joy? And are people's bodies better? And if so, then that's the God to follow.
Thank you very much. So I'm not acknowledging the names of who sent the question because we are getting the names either of the interpreter or whoever is posting the question to us. But I want you to know, whoever is asking a question, that we acknowledge you. And if your name comes with the question, we will acknowledge your name. So thank you. A question for Callid. Thank you for your vibrant talk. It was on Monday. Brazilian ecofeminist theologian Yvonne Gebara said that we have to relativize the notion of nostalgia as a fixity in a place that is of the past. This place is too important to Rubem Alves, since for many women, she said, for example, the past is a place of misery, of iniquity, of trauma. So they don't miss the past, but they miss the future, that utopian place they want to inhabit, a longing for the back, for going back to the past, and a longing for the future. So would it be correct to say that, I'm repeating, the naughty Rubem Alves points us to these two forms of longing?
I think probably in every way, Yvonne could do things better than me, so yes. I think that's my read of his work, at least. His emphasis on Saudade is always paired with utopia. That, like, if we just focus on reclaiming the past, we get these, especially in the United States context. I don't know if this is true in Brazil. I know it's true in Italy. This attempt to desire to return to the 50s as if somehow that was a golden age of civilization. It is this kind of thin desire for the maintenance of power, really. And if we think that that's the kind of saudade that he's talking about, I think it's a misread of his writing, first of all. And second of all, even if you think that, you have to remember that whenever that comes up, he always points to the future that has not yet arrived. So I think she's exactly right to kind of point both that he's a rascal and that there's a kind of we have to do these both. And when we point backwards, if the people who are in power are just more in power, something's off. That's what I would say.
Right. So, Yohanna, I felt that you want to jump in. Is that a fair perception on my part?
Maybe. One of the things I thought was the saudade for that which has been obliterated, that has been soterrado. Like, I think for looking to the past, we're trying to recover, reclaim, unearth that which colonization tried to annihilate. And soterrar, and sort of by forceful movement, burying by forceful movement, our histories, our practices, our bodies, our lands, our traditions, our wisdom, our healing practices. If we're looking for a saudade of the past, I think that's where it's placed, a longing remembrance there. And the future where that liberation exists. So we're not looking back at empire, seeking to reestablish empire, as a talk I was part of on Cláudio Carvalhais' book discussion last Saturday. There was a question, actually a statement that said, empires always get, replaced by other empires. So how do we work in the resistance, in the trenches, in defiance, disobeying empire? That's my 2 cents right there.
That's more than 2 cents. Very good, thank you. Victor Santos has a question to Callid, and with a kind of a lack of historicity, our West world seems to be locked in a production consumerist machine that ever points to forward. How can Rubem Alves helps us overcome that situation?
I mean, so from an academic perspective, his book, Tomorrow's Child, is all about that. So if you're interested, that's the book to read. I want to reiterate what I said earlier, though, which is, I think the thing that Alves points us to is sometimes more important than him. Maybe that's always true for academics, but I think he points us to the kind of work of resistance that Yohanna was showing us. And what he does is say, yes, this is important. Look, these textiles, these fabrics in the streets, they weave us together. So if I had to pick one, I would pick the resistance of the arts movements more than I would reading Alves, although there's no reason you can't do both. So I would say, yes, from an academic perspective, there's stuff in Tomorrow's Child all about this. I mean, essentially, that's what that book is about from my read. But if we're really talking about transformation and change, I think that some point in time, that reading has to become collaborative resistance work, actually done with living people who are, especially for folks like me who have a particularly set of privileges, putting things on the line. Otherwise, it just becomes a kind of thin hope, right? A hope that doesn't ever arrive because no work has been done in the body that makes it vulnerable. So by all means, read him. Tomorrow's Child is great. And if we're really going to do the work, we have to do something with these bodies and not just our minds, I think.
Thank you very much. For those who are hearing this in Brazil, Tomorrow's Child is Gestação do Futuro. So you can find these books, and it's a great book, and a book that I think must be read and engaged with. So I know that we are beyond time. We have to come to an end, unfortunately, but I have a question that I would like to ask Yohanna, and maybe if Callid wants to jump in as well. So a couple of times during this week and the conversation that we have had, we have heard people talking about quitting Rubem Alves. In some ways, I think that's the work that you are doing, and in particular what you did today, Yohanna. But I sense that, as Callid just said, Rubem Alves points to ways, but he does that from the limitations of his own body and place and times. If he is to be read meaningfully today, he has to be read in conversation with these new actors and new events and moments in conversations, and you are both doing that. What are your thoughts about this call for queering Rubem Alves, and how would that
I'm
look
all for
like?
it.
How should we queer Rubem Alves?
So I think the arts is an excellent way to begin this conversation around queering the work of Rubem Alves beyond a particular body that he occupied, right? A cis het body. And to liberate, challenge, liberate, and maybe heal some of the pathways that he points us toward. So I agree with Callid 100% that the roadmap, the pathway, the sort of clarão that he opens for us is embodied, it's striking, it's visceral, but the work needs to, live on. And one of the ways of doing that, as the arts is one of the ways of doing that, because precisely the fact that it's a site for world making, for dreaming, for rehearsing, choreographing new possibilities of being and intervening in the world. So as a laboratory for interdisciplinary research, queer artists, queer theorists, queer folks are poised with the capacity, I think, to enhance our understanding of how the historical and cultural amalgamations of his time kind of still circulate our bodies, but also offer opportunities to assess and then integrate how like multimodal processes of sort of appraising his work can be developed, that kind of resist, undo, and undermine the cis-het colonial project. I'm all for it. And I think the not so much Ligia Papi, but Vanessa German is precisely what they're doing with the, and I can name several others that I could put in conversation with Rubem Alves, several other queer artists that I could put in conversation with Rubem Alves's work, where we could open up ideas around like, how does the imagination kind of undo colonial apparatus, like a queer imagination undoes the colonial apparatus, and how it can sort of predict the next move of a colonial machinery, to anticipate, undo, and offer new movements that are beyond the binaries, that move beyond the binaries, and bodies as we, the normative bodies that we engage with or that we speak from, which was part of his experience. Does that make sense?
It totally does for me. Callid, do you want to say anything about this on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, everything Yohanna just said, 100%, and that's part of the reason for me I've started to play with this idea of the almond, right? Because there's a way in which kind of patriarchal kind of straight culture presumes that queerness is anti-straight, and that's a total misread of the thing. It's actually more
expansive.
Yeah, expansive. Thank you. Yeah, that it's an overlap. It's not a fight anymore, right? That fight worldview is part of the challenge, and in fact, this hybrid in between. And I don't remember if you used this word, but it was there, or I heard it there, Yohanna. The queerness isn't just about sexuality. I mean, it's an understanding that is we can think about time differently. We can think about family differently. We can think about academic production differently, right? That there's this overlapping space where it spills over. It's too full. The phenomenologists say it's super saturated, right? There's ways to think about it, and I really resist the miscategorization of queerness as somehow related to bodies and sex, and and the argumentation of pro for is part of an old vision of power that I don't think he would have been interested in, and I know I'm not, and I think Yohanna is not either.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is a conversation that could keep going, but I think we have reached more than we could expect in terms of the patience. Yes.
Something
Yohanna.
just occurred to me that I think it's important to name is that the seed for querying Alves is already there because of his emphasis on intimacy, the body, and vulnerability. So it's just germinate, like making sure that there are, fecund soils from which these seeds can grow. That's something that just occurred.
Thank you for that, because I think that was even the context in which this conversation came up earlier in previous discussions. So thank you. This is very helpful. Once again, I'm so appreciative of all the work that you do and all what you did for us and for this symposium. Yohanna, we lament that you have been facing challenges, health challenges, and yet you have been here. You didn't give up. You stayed and you participated so animatedly. So we are very, very grateful to you, to Callid. It's a pleasure to be with you. We hope that this will be a journey together. We hope that actually we can count on both of you to be full participants of this International Rubem Alves Society. One of the challenges that we have, and I think it's something at least we envision, is to see Rubem Alves at least known and discussed in the English-speaking academia. I think he has been forgotten, even at Princeton, where he did his doctoral work. Many of my students have never heard of him. And I think I'm one of the few who are still bringing him up. And I consider, as just both of you have shown, that he remains a relevant voice, an important voice for this century, for the conversation that we are having. So we'll certainly be in touch with you and look forward to seeing also these presentations published. That's our goal. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your participation, your questions, your engagement. I don't know if Arnaldo or Edson, they want to say anything to close. We will have another session tomorrow at the same time at 12 p.m. East time, 2 p.m. in Brasilia. And hopefully we'll see you then. I believe tomorrow is the panel from Italy. So if no one else has anything to say to close, I just close this with a
Raimundo,
yes.
Maybe we can remember about the working groups tomorrow.
Oh, okay, please
and
go ahead.
And the Italian meeting at Friday.
It's Friday. Well, tomorrow is the working groups. That's
yes.
I was switching the
yes.
two things. So tomorrow is the working group. So do you want to say something about that tomorrow?
No. Just to remember that, okay?
Yeah,
but
it's the same time.
Our symposium has its continuation
tomorrow and Friday. And the Italian panel is on Friday, not tomorrow. I'm sorry about that. I'll mix it up. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Até logo. Abraço. Muito obrigado. Obrigado, Yohanna e Callid. Eu vou entrar em contato com vocês. Amei a palestra de vocês. Quero usar no meu curso, no Spring, se vocês permitirem.